Hello, everyone. I'm really glad you're here. Now, settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin the first story. Jake Morrison had been pulling 18-wheelers across America's highways for 15 years, and in all that time, nothing had truly frightened him. He'd survived ice storms in Montana, dust devils in Arizona, and more close calls with four-wheelers than he cared to count. During the early morning hours of March 15th, 2023, the fog had rolled in somewhere past Rock Springs, thick and impenetrable, reducing visibility to mere feet beyond his headlights. At exactly 3:17 a.m., Jake's CB radio crackled to life with a voice he'd never heard before, crystal clear despite the atmospheric conditions that typically played havoc with radio signals. Eastbound Kenworth, at mile marker 142, the voice said with the calm professionalism of an experienced driver. "You've got a situation developing ahead." Jake glanced at his mile marker indicator and felt a chill. He was currently passing mile marker 141. Heavy fogs got a multi-vehicle accident, blocking both lanes. About 5 miles ahead, the stranger continued. "You're going to want to take the next exit and use the old highway to bypass it." Jake keyed his microphone. "Thanks for the heads up, good buddy. What's your 20? I'm about a mile behind you, just trying to help a fellow driver avoid some trouble." The voice was reassuring, but there was something about it that began to bother Jake as he followed the stranger's directions onto an older state highway, a slight echo, as if the person was speaking from inside a vast, empty space. "What kind of rig are you driving?" Jake asked, trying to make conversation as he navigated the narrow detour road. "Blue Peterbilt 379, classic model from the 80s. She's been good to me for a lot of years." Jake smiled at that. He'd driven a Pete 379 early in his career and had fond memories of that truck. But as he continued down the isolated highway, he began to notice that the landscape didn't match what he remembered from previous trips through this area. The road seemed to wind more than it should have, and the few structures visible in the fog looked abandoned in a way that suggested decades of emptiness. His mysterious companion continued to provide updates and directions, but Jake was starting to feel increasingly uneasy. The man claimed to have been driving these roads for 23 years, starting in 2001, but that would make it more than 23 years now. Not exactly 23. After nearly an hour of driving through fog on increasingly unfamiliar roads, Jake began to suspect something was seriously wrong. His fuel gauge hadn't moved despite the extended detour, and his odometer seemed to be advancing much more slowly than it should have been. Most disturbing of all, when he tried to call his dispatcher, he discovered he had no cell signal whatsoever. The CB radio, however, continued to work perfectly, and his guide seemed to anticipate his every question and concern. "Don't worry about the cell service," the voice said without being asked. "These old highways have dead zones that stretch for miles. You'll get your signal back once we get you reconnected to the main route." Jake was beginning to wonder how the stranger could know what he was thinking before he even keyed his radio to ask. The breakthrough came when Jake finally asked a question that had been nagging at him. "What's your name, driver? I like to know who I'm talking to on the radio." There was a long pause before the answer came, and when it did, Jake's blood ran cold. "Name's Robert Chen. Most folks on the road called me China Bob." Jake's hands tightened on the steering wheel as memories flooded back. Known for his encyclopedic knowledge of American highways, and his willingness to help other drivers in trouble. Jake had heard dozens of stories about China Bob over the years, and he'd always regretted never meeting the man in person. The problem was that Robert Chen had died in a truck accident on this very stretch of. It's 2018, March 15th. Jake's hands were shaking now as he realized the full implications. According to his truck's computer, it was 2023, not 2018, and March 15th, 2018, was the exact date that Robert Chen had died in a collision with a drunk driver who'd been traveling westbound in the eastbound lanes during heavy fog. "Bob," Jake said, his voice barely steady, "I need you to listen to me carefully. You need to pull over right now. There's a wrong-way driver ahead of you, and you're about to." The CB radio erupted with static, then went completely silent. Jake found himself alone on the dark highway, surrounded by fog so thick he couldn't see beyond his own headlights. His GPS suddenly sprang back to life, showing his correct position and indicating that he was on a legitimate state highway that would indeed reconnect him to Interstate 80. But when he tried to raise China Bob on the radio, there was no response. Over the next several minutes, Jake began encountering other eastbound truckers who confirmed that there had indeed been a multi-vehicle accident on the main interstate, exactly as Bob had warned him. When Jake asked if any of them had seen a blue Peterbilt 379 on the highway, they all reported the same thing. They'd heard someone giving directions and traffic updates on the CB, but they'd never actually seen another truck. Jake completed his delivery to Chicago without further incident, but the experience left him deeply shaken. He spent the following weeks researching the accident that had killed Robert Chen, and what he discovered made him question everything he thought he understood about the nature of reality. According to official reports, Chen had been traveling eastbound on Interstate 80 when he encountered a drunk driver in the wrong lanes. The accident had occurred at approximately 3:45 a.m. during heavy fog conditions. Several truckers had reported hearing him give detailed directions for alternate routes, potentially saving dozens of lives. The final transmission from Chen's radio had been a warning about a wrong-way driver, a warning that came too late to save his own life. Jake eventually learned that his experience was not unique. Over the years since Chen's death, more than a dozen truckers had reported similar encounters with a helpful voice on CB radio during dangerous weather conditions in Wyoming. The voice always identified itself as Robert Chen, always provided accurate warnings about road hazards, and always seemed to know exactly where each driver was located. Most disturbing of all, the encounters typically occurred on or around March 15th, the anniversary of Chen's death. Jake realized that he had been helped by someone who was continuing to do in death what he had done in life, protecting other drivers from the dangers of the road. The experience changed his understanding of the highways he traveled, making him aware that the roads carried more than just cargo and commerce. They carried the spirits of those who had dedicated their lives to the endless miles, and sometimes those spirits continued their work long after their earthly journey had ended. Let's dive in to the next disturbing story. Sarah Martinez had built her reputation on precision. In 12 years as an owner-operator, she had never missed a delivery deadline, specializing in time-sensitive loads that other drivers wouldn't touch. Her Freightliner Cascadia was equipped with the latest technology, and she ran her operation with the efficiency of a Swiss timepiece. On the night of September 3rd, 2023, Sarah was hauling computer servers from Seattle to Denver, running ahead of schedule, as always, when she decided to take a break at what appeared to be a standard truck stop along Interstate 90 in the remote stretches of Montana. The decision would trap her in a nightmare that challenged everything she thought she knew about the physical world. She had been driving for nearly 11 hours, pushing the limits of her logbook, but staying within legal parameters. The digital clock on her dashboard read 2:17 a.m. when she spotted the familiar glow of a truck stop's lights cutting through the darkness ahead. The facility appeared to be a standard travel center: fuel islands, a convenience store, and a parking area large enough for several dozen trucks. What caught her attention was how well maintained everything looked, despite the remote location. The pavement was freshly paved, the lighting was bright and modern, and the building itself had that clean corporate appearance of a major chain truck stop. Sarah pulled into the fuel island and began her routine, topping off her tanks, checking her oil, performing the walk-around inspection that was second nature after more than a decade on the road. As she was fueling, she noticed that despite the late hour, the truck stop seemed unusually busy. There were at least 20 other trucks parked in the lot, their drivers presumably sleeping or taking mandatory rest breaks. What struck her as odd was the variety of equipment. She saw everything from modern Peterbilts and Kenworths to older models that looked like they'd been well maintained but were clearly from previous decades. There was even what appeared to be a classic Mack from the 1980s, its chrome bumper gleaming under the fluorescent lights. After fueling, Sarah decided to grab coffee and a snack from the convenience store before finding a parking spot for her 10-hour break. The store was surprisingly well stocked for such a remote location, with hot food options, a wide selection of trucking supplies, and even a small dining area with booths where drivers could sit and eat. Behind the counter was a clerk who looked to be in his 50s, wearing a name tag that read Frank. He greeted Sarah with the kind of professional friendliness that suggested he'd been working truck stops for years. "Evening, driver. How's the road treating you tonight?" Frank asked as he rang up her coffee and sandwich. "Can't complain," Sarah replied. "This is a nice facility you've got here. I don't remember seeing it on this route before." Frank's smile seemed to falter slightly. "We've been here for a while," he said. "Folks sometimes don't notice us until they really need us." Sarah found a parking spot near the back of the lot and climbed into her sleeper berth, setting her alarm for 12:30 p.m. to give herself a full 10 hours of rest. She'd been asleep for what felt like several hours when she was awakened by the sound of voices outside her truck. Checking her phone, she was surprised to see that it was only 3:45 a.m. She'd been asleep for barely an hour and a half, but she felt like she'd been out for much longer. The voices belonged to a group of drivers standing near a classic Peterbilt 359, engaged in what sounded like a heated discussion about routes and delivery schedules. What bothered Sarah was that their conversation seemed to reference cities and highways using names she didn't recognize. Despite her extensive knowledge of the American road system, unable to get back to sleep, Sarah decided to get up and walk around the facility to stretch her legs. The truck stop seemed different in the pre-dawn darkness. The layout appeared to have changed somehow, with the fuel islands positioned differently than she remembered. The convenience store was still open, but when she walked inside, she noticed that the merchandise had been rearranged. Most unsettling of all, Frank was still behind the counter, wearing the same clothes and offering the same professional smile, as if no time had passed at all. back already?" he asked. "Sometimes drivers have trouble sleeping here. The altitude can affect some people." Sarah knew that the elevation in this part of Montana wasn't high enough to cause altitude-related sleep issues, but she didn't argue with the man. As she walked back toward her truck, she encountered another driver, a woman in her 40s, wearing a Caterpillar hat and a worn denim jacket. "First time at this place?" the woman asked, extending her hand in greeting. "I'm Janet. Been driving for 18 years, and I've never seen anything quite like this." "Stop." Sarah shook her hand and introduced herself, then asked what Janet meant by her comment. "Well," Janet said, glancing round nervously, "I pulled in here about 6 hours ago for a quick fuel stop. Was planning to be back on the road in 30 minutes, but every time I try to leave, something happens. First, my truck wouldn't start, engine would turn over, but wouldn't catch. Then, when I finally got it running, the exit seemed to lead me right back into the parking lot. I've tried leaving 4 different times, and I keep ending up right back here." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Montana night air. "Have you talked to anyone else about this?" Janet nodded toward a cluster of trucks near the building. "There's about a dozen of us having the same problem. Some of these guys have been here for days, according to what they're telling me. But here's the really weird part: none of us are getting hungry or tired like we should be. It's like time isn't moving the same way here." Sarah looked at her phone and was shocked to see that it was still showing 3:45 a.m. The same time she'd checked it nearly an hour ago. The digital clock on the truck stop sign displayed the same time, frozen, as if someone had stopped all the clocks in the facility simultaneously. Determined to understand what was happening, Sarah walked over to the group of drivers that Janet had mentioned. They were a mix of men and women, ranging in age from their 30s to their 60s, all wearing the practical clothing of professional truckers. Each of them had a similar story. They'd stopped at the facility for routine purposes and found themselves unable to leave. Some reported that their trucks would start, but the exit roads would somehow loop back to the parking lot. Others said their vehicles would develop mechanical problems that prevented departure, only to have those problems mysteriously resolve themselves when they weren't actively trying to leave. One driver, a grizzled veteran named Pete, who claimed to have been stuck there for 3 days, told Sarah that the facility seemed to change its layout every few hours, with buildings moving, parking spaces reconfiguring, and even the number of fuel islands varying from visit to visit. Sarah decided to test their claims by attempting to leave herself. She started her Freightliner and pulled out of her parking space, following the clearly marked exit signs toward the highway. The road seemed normal at first, but as she drove what should have been a straight path back to Interstate 90, she found herself driving in a wide circle that brought her right back to the truck stop entrance. She tried again, this time taking a different route and carefully watching her GPS for guidance. The GPS screen showed her moving in a straight line away from the facility, but her physical location remained unchanged. She was still circling back to the same parking lot. On her 3rd attempt, she noticed something that made her question her own sanity. The facility's buildings had rearranged themselves while she was driving, with the convenience store now positioned where the maintenance building had been, and the fuel islands rotated 90 degrees from their original orientation. The most disturbing discovery came when Sarah checked her logbook and compared it to her truck's electronic monitoring system. According to every timepiece in her possession, she had been at the facility for less than 2 hours, but her truck's engine computer showed that she'd been idling for more than 14 hours. The fuel gauge, which had been nearly full when she arrived, now showed less than a quarter tank, despite the fact that she'd topped off her tanks and hadn't driven more than a few miles in circles around the facility. Her cell phone showed no signal, but more troubling was the fact that her satellite communication system, which was supposed to work anywhere in North America, was completely offline. She was cut off from the outside world in a way that shouldn't have been possible with modern technology. As dawn should have been breaking, Sarah realized that the sky remained locked in the same pre-dawn darkness that had greeted her hours earlier. The other trapped drivers had formed an informal support group, sharing food and information as they tried to make sense of their situation. Some had begun to suspect that the facility existed in some kind of temporal pocket, disconnected from the normal flow of time and space. Others theorized that they had somehow driven into a parallel dimension where the normal rules of physics didn't apply. What they all agreed on was that the truck stop was more than just a rest facility. It was a trap designed to capture travelers who were unfortunate enough to discover it during their journey across the lonely highways of America. Days passed, or what felt like days, in a place where time had no meaning. The breakthrough came when Sarah realized that acceptance was the key. Instead of fighting against her situation, she began to embrace the strange reality of the infinite rest stop. She started to see it not as a prison, but as a lesson about the nature of time and the importance of the present moment. When she finally approached the exit for what felt like the 100th time, she did so without desperation or anger, but with a sense of gratitude for the experience. The road ahead remained straight and true, leading her back to Interstate 90 and the world of linear time. Sarah completed her delivery to Denver without further incident, but the experience had fundamentally altered her understanding of reality. Carl Thompson had spent 25 years building his reputation as one of the most reliable drivers in the Southeast. His pristine 2018 Peterbilt 389 was a testament to his professionalism. Every chrome surface polished to a mirror finish, every mechanical component maintained with religious precision, every logbook entry recorded with the accuracy of a man who took pride in doing things right. On the night of January 23, 2024, Carl was hauling medical equipment from Jacksonville to Atlanta, running his familiar route on Interstate 75 through the heart of Georgia. Carl had departed Jacksonville at 10 p.m., timing his departure to arrive in Atlanta during the early morning hours when traffic was lightest and unloading could proceed without delays. He'd been driving this particular route for over a decade, and he knew every mile marker. The night was clear and cold, with visibility that stretched for miles in every direction. Perfect conditions for making good time while maintaining the fuel efficiency that had made Carl one of the most profitable owner-operators in the Southeast. At 1:17 a.m., Carl was passing through the rural stretches of South Georgia, running slightly ahead of schedule and enjoying the peaceful solitude that came with night driving. The first sign that something was wrong came when Carl noticed an unusual amount of activity on his CB radio. Normally, the airwaves were relatively quiet during the early morning hours, with only occasional transmissions from other night drivers sharing weather reports or traffic information. Tonight, however, the radio was buzzing with confused chatter from multiple drivers, all reporting the same bizarre phenomenon. "I'm seeing the same truck in 2 different places," one voice reported. "There's a Peterbilt 389 in the southbound lanes, and I swear I just saw the exact same truck in the northbound lanes. Same color, same configuration, even the same driver. Carl keyed his microphone to respond, but before he could speak, another voice cut in. I'm seeing the same thing. There's definitely two identical Pete 389s running in opposite directions. Carl decided to investigate by pulling over at the next rest area to get a better look at the northbound traffic. As he parked his truck and walked to the edge of the facility, he could see the headlights of northbound traffic approaching from the south. What he saw made his blood run cold. There, in the northbound lanes, was a truck that appeared to be identical to his own same model, same color scheme, same chrome configuration. Carl grabbed his binoculars from his truck and focused on the northbound Peterbilt as it passed the rest area. The driver was not just similar to Carlet, was Carl, down to the last detail. Same face, same hair, same posture behind the wheel. Even the same way of holding the steering wheel that Carl had developed over decades of driving. The truck's license plate, company logos, and even the pattern of road grime on the trailer were identical to Carl's own rig. As the truck disappeared into the distance, Carl noticed that other drivers in the rest area were pointing and taking pictures, clearly aware that they were witnessing something impossible. A driver approached Carl and said, "Buddy, I just saw your truck going north while you're standing here. How the hell is that possible?" Carl climbed back into his truck and resumed his journey, but the experience had left him deeply shaken. He tried to rationalize what he'd seen, considering explanations ranging from coincidence to some kind of elaborate prank, but nothing could account for the perfect duplication of every detail, including his own physical appearance. "There's definitely two Carl Thompsons out here tonight," one voice reported. "I know Carl personally, and I just talked to him at the Valdosta truck stop, but I'm also seeing him in the southbound lanes right now." Carl keyed his microphone and identified himself, but the response from other drivers was immediate and disturbing. "Carl, I'm looking at you right now in the southbound lanes, but I also just saw you 20 minutes ago heading north. Which one is the real Carl?" The question haunted Carl as he continued his journey toward Atlanta. He began to wonder if he was somehow experiencing a breakdown in reality, or if there was indeed another version of himself driving the highways of Georgia. The reports from other drivers were too consistent and detailed to be dismissed as misidentification or mass hallucination. The night manager, a woman named Betty, who had worked there even longer than Carl had been driving, greeted him with a confused expression. "Carl, what are you doing back here? You were just here an hour ago, heading north with a load of electronics, which bore his truck's number and his signature, but in handwriting that was slightly different from his own. The receipt was dated 2 hours earlier, during a time when Carl had been more than 100 miles away from Tifton." Betty called over another employee, who confirmed that Carl had indeed been at the truck stop earlier, engaging in the same friendly conversation that he always had with the staff. "But you seemed a little different," the employee noted, "more quiet than usual, and you kept looking around like you were expecting someone." The revelation that his doppelganger was not just being seen by other drivers, but was actually interacting with people who knew Carl personally, sent him into a spiral of confusion and fear. Carl realized that whatever was happening was more than just a visual phenomenon. There was apparently another version of himself that was living a parallel existence, making the same stops, following the same routes, and engaging with the same people. The implications were staggering. If there were two versions of Carl Thompson driving the highways of Georgia, which one was real? Carl began to question his own memories and experiences. wondering if he might be the duplicate rather than the original. As Carl continued toward Atlanta, he began to notice that his truck was behaving differently than usual. The engine sounded slightly off, with a minor vibration that he'd never experienced before. The GPS was showing small discrepancies in his location, placing him a few hundred yards away from where he knew he actually was. Most disturbing of all, his CB radio was picking up transmissions that seemed to be coming from his own truck, as if he was somehow communicating with himself. Carl heard his own voice giving traffic reports, discussing fuel prices, and chatting with other drivers about weather conditions. The conversations were identical to ones that Carl remembered having, but they were happening in real time while he was listening to them. The climax came when Carl encountered his doppelganger directly. As he approached the outskirts of Atlanta, he crested a hill and saw in the distance a northbound truck that was unmistakably his own. As the two trucks approached each other, Carl could see that the other driver was indeed identical to himself in every detail. The moment of passing lasted only a few seconds, but during that time, Carl made eye contact with his duplicate. The other Carl appeared to be just as shocked and confused as he was, and both men turned to watch each other's trucks disappear into the distance. The experience was so surreal that Carl began to wonder if he was experiencing a complete mental breakdown, or if the highways of Georgia had somehow become a place where the laws of physics and identity no longer applied. Carl completed his delivery to Atlanta without further incident, but the experience of encountering his doppelganger had fundamentally changed his understanding of reality. He learned that the highways were more than just transportation infrastructure. They were spaces where the boundaries between possible and impossible became blurred. The road had shown him that identity itself was more fluid than he'd ever imagined, and that sometimes the person looking back at you from the mirror might not be the same person who started the journey. Carl never encountered his duplicate again, but he never forgot the lesson that Interstate 75 had taught him about the nature of self and the hidden dimensions that existed within America's highway system. In the quiet hours of night driving that followed, Carl would sometimes catch glimpses of movement in his mirrors that made him wonder if his other self was still out there, driving the same routes, living the same life, existing in a parallel reality that occasionally brushed against his own. The highway had taught him that there were more versions of reality than the human mind could easily comprehend, and that sometimes the most disturbing encounters were not with strangers, but with the infinite possibilities of who we might have been or who we might still become. Let's dive into the next disturbing story. Rebecca Walsh had always prided herself on precision. In 10 years, as a long-haul specialist, she had developed an almost mathematical approach to trucking that had made her one of the most sought-after independent contractors in the upper Midwest. Her 2020 Freightliner, Cascadia, was equipped with the latest navigation technology and efficiency monitoring systems, tools that helped her maintain the precise fuel economy and delivery schedules that had built her reputation. On the morning of December 14, 2023, Rebecca was hauling server equipment from Minneapolis to Portland, running her usual route on Interstate 90 through the endless prairie landscapes of South Dakota, when she encountered a phenomenon that would trap her in a nightmare loop of repeating reality. Rebecca had departed Minneapolis at 6 p.m. the previous evening, timing her departure to put her in the empty stretches of South Dakota during the pre-dawn hours, when traffic was lightest and fuel efficiency was at its peak. She'd been driving for nearly 10 hours, making excellent time across the frozen landscape, when she found herself approaching a section of highway that she'd traveled hundreds of times before. The stretch between Mitchell and Chamberlain was a straight, flat run of about 60 miles that drivers often used as a benchmark for their overall trip progress. Rebecca knew every mile marker, every overpass, and every landmark along this section of road. At exactly 4:03 a.m., she passed mile marker 248, noting that she was running about 30 minutes ahead of schedule, and her fuel consumption was tracking perfectly for the trip. The first sign that something was wrong came when Rebecca noticed that her fuel gauge hadn't moved in what felt like an hour of driving. She'd been monitoring her fuel consumption carefully, as she always did, and knew that she should have used approximately 15 gallons since her last fuel stop in Mitchell. The gauge, however, showed exactly the same level it had displayed when she'd passed mile marker 248. Rebecca initially attributed this to a possible sensor malfunction, but her truck's advanced monitoring system showed no error codes, and all other systems were functioning normally. More puzzling was the fact that her odometer seemed to be advancing much more slowly than it should have been, despite the fact that her speedometer showed a steady 65 miles per hour. Rebecca began to pay closer attention to the landmarks around her, using the technique that veteran drivers employed to track their progress when electronic systems failed. She noted a distinctive farmhouse with a red barn, a water tower with Reliance painted on its side, and a billboard advertising a casino in Deadwood. These landmarks were familiar to her, and she used them to confirm her position on the highway. 20 minutes later, she was startled to see the same farmhouse, water tower, and billboard appearing in her headlights again, in exactly the same sequence and with the same spacing between them. Rebecca checked her GPS and confirmed that she was still heading west on Interstate 90. But the repeated landmarks suggested that she was somehow driving in a circle, despite the fact that the highway was perfectly straight. Determined to solve the mystery, Rebecca began to pay meticulous attention to every detail of her surroundings. She noted the exact time when she passed each landmark, the precise mileage reading on her odometer, and the fuel level displayed on her gauge. At 4:31 a.m., she passed mile marker 248 again, with her fuel gauge showing exactly the same level and her odometer reading exactly the same mileage as it had nearly 30 minutes earlier. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She was somehow reliving the same stretch of highway over and over again, trapped in a loop that reset itself every time she reached a certain point on the road. Rebecca tried using her CB radio to contact other drivers, but the airwaves were strangely quiet for a major interstate corridor. She attempted to call her dispatcher on her cell phone, but discovered that she had no signal despite being in an area where she'd never had connectivity problems before. Her satellite communication system, which was designed to work anywhere in North America, showed no available satellites. Most disturbing of all, her GPS continued to show her making normal progress westward. But the physical evidence of her surroundings proved that she was covering the same ground repeatedly. The electronic systems in her truck seemed to be unaware of the temporal anomaly that had trapped her. As Rebecca continued to loop through the same section of Highway S, she began to notice subtle changes in her environment that suggested the phenomenon was more complex than a simple repetition. The weather conditions shifted slightly with each loop. Sometimes the sky was clear, sometimes there was a light snowfall, and occasionally fog would roll across the prairie. The traffic patterns changed as well, with different vehicles appearing and disappearing at various points along the route. During one loop, she encountered a convoy of military vehicles that hadn't been there before. During another, she saw a classic car show parked at a rest area that had been empty during previous cycles. These variations suggested that she wasn't simply repeating the same moment in time, but rather cycling through different versions of the same stretch of highway. The psychological impact of the time loop began to wear on Rebecca after the first dozen cycles. She experimented with different approaches to breaking free from the pattern, trying everything from varying her speed to taking the exits that led to small towns along the route. Each attempt led to the same results. She would find herself back at mile marker 248 with the same fuel level, the same odometer reading, and the same sense of déjà vu. The exits seemed to lead to towns that were slightly different from what she remembered, with buildings in different locations and businesses that didn't match her previous knowledge of the area. When she tried to stop at a truck stop that she'd visited many times before, she found that the facility had a different layout and was staffed by people she'd never seen before. Rebecca's attempts to document her experience proved futile, as each loop reset not just her truck systems, but also her personal belongings reverted to their previous state. Notes she wrote would disappear, photos she took with her phone would vanish, and voice recordings she made would be erased when the loop reset. She began to suspect that she was trapped in some kind of temporal pocket, a bubble of space-time that existed outside the normal flow of reality. The highway had become a prison, and she was the only person who retained any memory of the repeating cycles. The knowledge that she was trapped in an endless loop of the same 60-mile stretch of highway was both terrifying and maddening. The breakthrough came during what Rebecca estimated to be her 40th loop through the same section of highway. She had begun to notice that certain elements of her environment were responsive to her thoughts and emotions. When she felt frustrated, the weather would turn stormy. When she felt hopeful, the sunrise would appear more beautiful than usual. When she felt angry, other vehicles would behave more aggressively around her. Rebecca realized that her mental state was somehow influencing the reality of the time loop, suggesting that her consciousness was more deeply connected to the phenomenon than she had initially understood. During her 47th loop, Rebecca made a decision that went against every instinct she'd developed as a professional driver. Instead of trying to escape the loop or fight against it, she decided to embrace the experience and see what lessons it might teach her. She began to pay attention to details she'd previously overlooked: the way the morning light played across the prairie grass, the patterns of wind that moved across the landscape, the subtle variations in the road surface that told the story of decades of weather and traffic. She started to see the highway not as a means of transportation, but as a living entity with its own consciousness and purpose. Rebecca's acceptance of her situation seemed to be the key to her eventual escape. During her 51st loop, she found herself genuinely grateful for the opportunity to experience the beauty of the South Dakota landscape in a way that no other driver ever had. She had seen the same stretch of highway under dozens of different conditions, at different times of day, and in different seasons. She had witnessed the full spectrum of prairie weather and light, and she had come to understand the highway as a complex ecosystem, rather than just a strip of asphalt. When she reached mile marker 248 on that 51st loop, she was surprised to see mile marker 249 appear in her headlights for the first time in hours. The experience of being trapped in the time loop had changed Rebecca's entire approach to long-haul trucking. She had learned that the highways were more than just transportation infrastructure. They were spaces where consciousness and reality intersected in ways that science couldn't fully explain. The road had taught her that time and space were more fluid than she'd ever imagined, and that the journey was often more important than the destination. Rebecca completed her delivery to Portland without further incident. But she never forgot the lesson that Interstate 90 had taught her about the nature of reality and the hidden dimensions that existed within America's highway system. In the years that followed, she would sometimes find herself driving more slowly through beautiful stretches of highway, taking time to appreciate the landscapes that other drivers rushed past without seeing. The time loop had taught her that there were infinite possibilities hidden within every mile of road, and that sometimes the most profound journeys were the ones that took you deeper into the same place, rather than farther from where you started. Let's dive into the next disturbing story. Tommy Rodriguez had been running team operations for 8 years, splitting driving duties with his partner, Carlos, on long-haul routes that kept them moving around the clock. Their 2019 Peterbilt 579 had logged over 800,000 miles without a single missed delivery, and Tommy was the designated night driver, preferring the quiet roads and lighter traffic that came with darkness. On the night of October 12, 2023, Tommy was piloting their rig westbound on Interstate 40 through the remote stretches of New Mexico, hauling automotive parts from Detroit to Phoenix, when he first noticed the headlights in his mirrors that would haunt him for the next 300 miles. The shift change had occurred at a truck stop in Amarillo, Texas, where Carlos had crawled into the sleeper berth for his mandatory 10-hour break, while Tommy took control of the wheel. The weather was clear, with a new moon that left the desert landscape in almost complete darkness beyond the reach of his headlights. Tommy appreciated these conditions. The lack of ambient light meant he could see the glow of approaching traffic from miles away, and the empty roads allowed him to maintain a steady cruise speed that maximized fuel efficiency. At 11:47 p.m., he was making excellent time as he crossed into New Mexico, running ahead of schedule and looking forward to an easy night of driving through sparsely populated desert terrain. It was just after midnight when Tommy first noticed the distinctive pattern of headlights in his driver's side mirror. The lights belonged to what appeared to be another 18-wheeler running about a quarter mile behind him and maintaining a consistent distance. What caught Tommy's attention was how the headlights seemed unusually bright, not the typical halogen or LED lights that most trucks used, but something that casts a harsh white light that seemed to cut through the darkness with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable to look at directly. Tommy initially assumed it was another expedited freight hauler running a similar schedule, but as the minutes passed, he began to notice that the following truck never seemed to gain or lose ground, maintaining exactly the same distance regardless of Tommy's speed. Tommy decided to test his theory by gradually increasing his speed from 65 to 70 miles per hour, change that should have caused a following vehicle to either fall behind or close the gap. The headlights in his mirror remained at exactly the same distance, as if the other truck had matched his speed increase perfectly. Tommy then reduced his speed to 60 miles per hour, expecting to see the other truck either pass him or pull in behind him at a closer distance. Again, the headlights maintained their exact position, never wavering from their quarter-mile following distance. Tommy reached for his CB radio and keyed the microphone. Westbound truck, about a quarter mile behind the Pete 579, at mile marker 312. You copy. The radio remained silent, except for the occasional static burst of distant conversations from other drivers hundreds of miles away. As Tommy continued driving, he began to notice other unusual characteristics of his mysterious follower. The headlights never seemed to dim or brighten in response to oncoming traffic, which was standard practice among professional drivers to avoid blinding other motorists. More disturbing was the fact that the lights never showed the slight variations in height and angle that would be expected from a truck traveling over the natural rise and fall of the highway. The headlights remained perfectly level and steady, as if they were floating at a fixed height above the road surface. Tommy tried using his high beams to get a better look at the truck in his mirrors, but the angle and distance made it impossible to make out any details beyond the hypnotic glow of those unnaturally bright headlights. The first real sign that something was seriously wrong came when Tommy encountered a construction zone that required him to merge into the left lane. As he activated his turn signal and began to move over, he glanced in his mirror to check the position of the following truck. What he saw made his blood run cold. The headlights were no longer behind him. Instead, they were positioned directly alongside him in the right lane, maintaining the same quarter-mile distance, but now running parallel to his position. Tommy looked out his passenger window and saw nothing but empty highway. Yet his mirrors clearly showed the headlights keeping pace with him in the lane he'd just vacated. He completed the lane change and continued through the construction zone, but the headlights remained in his mirrors, impossibly positioned where no truck should have been able to maintain that speed and distance. After clearing the construction zone, Tommy tried to catch up to the mysterious truck by accelerating to 75 miles per hour, well above the posted speed limit, but within the range that most enforcement officers would tolerate. The headlights in his mirror remained at their exact distance, suggesting that the other truck had matched his speed increase, despite the fact that Tommy was now traveling faster than most commercial vehicles could legally or safely maintain. Tommy activated his hazard lights and began to slow down, thinking that perhaps he could force the other truck to pass him and finally get a clear look at the vehicle that had been following him for over an hour. As his speed dropped to 45 miles per hour, the headlights maintained their position, apparently content to crawl along the highway at whatever speed Tommy chose to maintain. The situation became even more disturbing when Tommy realized that his mysterious follower was having impossible interactions with other traffic. When an eastbound truck passed in the opposite direction, Tommy watched in his mirror as the other truck's headlights briefly illuminated what should have been the cab and trailer of his follower. Instead of the expected silhouette of a tractor trailer, Tommy saw nothing but empty road bathed in the glow of those persistent headlights. The eastbound truck continued on its way, without any sign that the driver had noticed anything unusual, despite the fact that the headlights were clearly visible in Tommy's mirrors. Tommy tried using his CB radio to contact the eastbound driver, but received no response to his increasingly frantic calls. Tommy's partner, Carlos, woke up around 2:30 a.m., stirring in the sleeper berth as he prepared to take over driving duties at their next scheduled stop. "How's it going out there?" Carlos asked, climbing into the passenger seat to keep Tommy company during the final hours of his shift. "We've got company," Tommy replied, nodding toward the mirrors. "There's been a truck following us for the past 2.5 hours, maintaining the exact same distance, no matter what I do." Carlos looked in the mirrors and confirmed that he could see the headlights. But when he leaned forward to look out the back window of the sleeper berth, he reported seeing nothing but empty highway. Maybe it's just the angle, Carlos suggested. But Tommy could hear the uncertainty in his partner's voice. The pair decided to stop at the next truck stop to fuel up and see if their mysterious follower would reveal itself. As they pulled into the Flying J at mile marker 277, Tommy watched his mirrors carefully to see what the other truck would do. The headlights followed them into the truck stop, but instead of pulling into a parking space or fuel lane, they simply stopped at the entrance to the facility and remained there, casting their harsh white light across the empty asphalt. Tommy and Carlos completed their fuel stop and walked around the facility, looking for any sign of the truck that had been following them. They found nothing, no vehicle that matched the headlights they'd been seeing, no driver who admitted to following them, and no explanation for the lights that were still visible from the truck stop entrance. When Tommy and Carlos returned to their truck and prepared to leave, the headlights were still waiting at the entrance. As they pulled back onto Interstate 40, their mysterious follower resumed its position exactly a quarter mile behind them, as if it had never stopped at all. Carlos took over driving duties at that point, but the headlights continued to follow them for another 50 miles before finally disappearing just as suddenly as they had appeared. Tommy spent the rest of the night in the sleeper berth, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched by something that existed just beyond the edge of normal perception. The experience left Tommy with a profound sense of unease about the highways he'd traveled safely for years. He began to research similar encounters and discovered that the phenomenon of phantom trucks was more common than he'd ever imagined. Other drivers reported being followed by vehicles that cast no shadows, left no tire tracks, and seemed to exist only in mirrors and peripheral vision. Some described the headlights as having a hypnotic quality that made it difficult to look away, while others reported that the phantom vehicles would disappear when approached directly, but reappear as soon as the observer's attention shifted elsewhere. Tommy learned that the highways carried more than just commercial traffic. They were home to entities that moved through the darkness with purposes that living drivers could never fully understand. The experience had taught him that the roads were populated by more than just flesh and blood travelers, and that sometimes the most persistent followers were those who existed in the spaces between reality and imagination. In the months that followed, Tommy would occasionally catch glimpses of unusual headlights in his mirrors during late-night drives, but he learned to focus on the road ahead rather than dwelling on what might be following behind. The highway had taught him that there were some mysteries that were better left unexplored, and that the safest policy was to keep moving forward, no matter what might be tracking your progress through the endless darkness of America's loneliest roads. Let's dive in to the next disturbing story. Diana Martinez had been a hazmat certified driver for 14 years, specializing in the transport of dangerous materials that required both extensive training and nerves of steel. Her 2017 Kenworth T680 was equipped with every safety system mandated by federal regulations, making her one of the most trusted drivers in the chemical transport industry. On the night of February 18, 2024, Diana was hauling industrial chemicals from Denver to Salt Lake City, running her usual route through the treacherous mountain passes of Colorado, when she encountered a way station that would challenge everything she thought she knew about the infrastructure that governed commercial trucking. Diana had departed Denver at 11 p.m., timing her departure to navigate the most dangerous sections of Interstate 7. Oh, during the early morning hours, when traffic was lightest and weather conditions were most predictable, her trailer was loaded with 40,000 pounds of various chemical compounds destined for a manufacturing facility in Utah. Each container properly labeled, secured, and documented according to Department of Transportation regulations. The hazmat endorsement on her commercial driver's license represented years of training and testing, and Diana took pride in her perfect safety record and her reputation for handling the most challenging loads in the industry. The night was clear and cold, with temperatures well below freezing, but the highway was dry and road conditions were ideal for maintaining the steady pace that hazmat loads required. At 3:17 a.m., Diana was climbing through the high mountain passes west of Denver when she encountered a way station that she'd never seen before. Despite having driven this route hundreds of times over the past decade, the facility appeared to be a standard commercial vehicle inspection station, with familiar overhead signs directing trucks to enter for mandatory weight and safety checks. What surprised Diana was the location. She knew every way station along this corridor, and there hadn't been one at this particular spot during her last trip through the area just 2 weeks earlier. The station looked new, with fresh pavement, modern LED lighting, and state-of-the-art inspection equipment that suggested a recent construction project that she'd somehow missed hearing about in the industry publications she read religiously. Diana pulled her truck onto the scales, as directed, following the standard procedure for hazmat loads that required additional documentation and inspection protocols. The way station was staffed by 2 officers wearing Colorado State Patrol uniforms, complete with the proper insignia and equipment that she'd expect from legitimate enforcement personnel. The first officer, whose name tag read Johnson, approached her driver's window with the professional demeanor of someone who'd been conducting commercial vehicle inspections for years. "Evening, driver," he said. "We're conducting a routine hazmat inspection tonight. I'll need to see your CDL medical card, hazmat endorsement, and all shipping documentation." Diana handed over her credentials and paperwork, noting that Officer Johnson's uniform and badge appeared authentic in every detail. The inspection process was thorough and professional, with both officers demonstrating the kind of expertise that came from years of experience with hazmat regulations. They checked every aspect of Diana's load, from the proper placarding on her trailer to the emergency response information required for each type of chemical she was transporting. Officer Johnson's partner, identified as Williams, conducted a detailed examination of Diana's electronic logbook, verifying that her hours of service were in compliance with federal regulations. The inspection took nearly 40 minutes, which was longer than usual, but not unprecedented for a hazmat load. Throughout the process, both officers maintained the courteous but authoritative manner that Diana had come to expect from legitimate enforcement personnel. What began to trouble Diana was the unusual number of questions the officers asked about her route and destination. While safety inspections typically focused on the technical aspects of the load and the driver's qualifications, these officers seemed unusually interested in the specific chemicals she was carrying and their intended use at the manufacturing facility in Utah. Officer Williams asked detailed questions about the chemical processes that would be used with her cargo, questions that went far beyond the scope of a routine safety inspection. "Are you familiar with the specific industrial applications of these compounds?" Williams asked, referring to a clipboard that contained information about Diana's load that she hadn't provided. "We're conducting a special investigation into the transport of certain chemical combinations." Diana became increasingly uncomfortable as the inspection continued, particularly when she realized that the officers were asking questions that suggested they had access to information that wasn't contained in her shipping papers. They knew details about the chemical composition of her load that were classified as proprietary information by the shipper, and they seemed to understand the industrial processes that would be used with the chemicals better than most safety inspectors would. When Diana asked to see their identification again, both officers readily complied, producing credentials that appeared legitimate. The badge numbers didn't follow the standard format she was familiar with, and the photographs on their identification cards seemed slightly off, as if they'd been altered or doctored. The situation became truly alarming when Diana noticed that the way station's computer systems were displaying information that couldn't possibly be accurate. The electronic scale showed her truck's weight as being exactly 80,000 pounds, which was the maximum legal limit, despite the fact that her actual loaded weight was closer to 75,000 pounds. The inspection computer displayed a driver history that included trips she'd never made and violations she'd never committed. Most disturbing of all, the system showed her as having been inspected at this same way station multiple times over the past year, despite the fact that she was certain this facility hadn't existed until tonight. When she pointed out these discrepancies to the officers, they dismissed her concerns with explanations that seemed plausible, but didn't address the fundamental impossibility of the data they were showing her. As the inspection dragged on, Diana began to notice other troubling details about the facility and its personnel. The way station building had no windows, which was unusual for a structure that was supposed to house administrative offices and break rooms for inspection personnel. The parking area was perfectly clean, with no evidence of the oil stains, tire marks, or general wear that would be expected from a facility that processed hundreds of commercial vehicles. Most unsettling of all, the officers' radios occasionally crackled with transmissions that seemed to be coming from dispatch centers that didn't exist, using call signs and procedures that didn't match standard law enforcement protocols. Diana heard references to project oversight and chemical route monitoring that suggested the inspection was part of some larger operation that went beyond routine safety enforcement. The climax came when Diana asked to contact her dispatcher to report the extended delay. Officer Johnson handed her a phone and told her to make the call, but when she dialed her company's number, she was connected to a voice that claimed to be her dispatcher, but knew details about her employment that the real dispatcher wouldn't have access to. The voice on the phone confirmed that Diana was authorized to carry her current load and instructed her to comply fully with the inspection. But the conversation felt scripted and artificial. The line went dead. Diana's growing sense of panic reached a breaking point when she noticed that the way station's clock displayed a time that didn't match her truck's chronometer or her cell phone, according to the facility's timepiece. She'd been at the way station for less than 15 minutes, but her own instruments showed that nearly 2 hours had passed since she'd entered the facility. The discrepancy was impossible to explain, and it suggested that the way station existed in some kind of temporal pocket that operated according to different rules than the outside world. When she pointed out this inconsistency to the officers, they seemed genuinely confused, as if they weren't aware of the time distortion that was affecting the facility. The inspection finally concluded with Officer Johnson declaring that Diana's load was approved for continued transport. But the experience had left her deeply shaken. As she prepared to leave the way station, she noticed that the facility's entrance and exit ramps seemed to lead directly back to Interstate 70, despite the fact that she remembered taking a more complex route to reach the scales. When she looked in her mirrors, as she pulled back onto the highway, she was stunned to see that the way station had completely disappeared, leaving only an empty patch of mountainside where the facility had stood moments before. The pavement, lighting, and buildings had vanished without a trace, as if they'd never existed at all. Diana immediately pulled over at the next rest area and called her real dispatcher. And her truck's GPS tracking system displayed a continuous record of movement along Interstate 70 with no deviation to a way station. The chemical load arrived in Salt Lake City on schedule, with no evidence that it had been inspected or tampered with during the journey. Diana's experience at the vanishing way station had taught her that the highways were monitored by entities that existed outside the normal framework of law enforcement, and that sometimes the most routine aspects of commercial trucking could become gateways to encounters with forces that operated beyond human understanding. In the months that followed, Diana would sometimes notice inspection stations that seemed to appear and disappear at the edge of her vision. But she learned to trust her memories and her instruments rather than the apparently solid evidence of roadside infrastructure that might not be entirely real. The highway had taught her that the boundaries between the official and the otherworldly were more porous than she'd ever imagined, and that sometimes the most thorough inspections were conducted by authorities whose jurisdiction extended far beyond the physical world. Let's dive into the next disturbing story. Eddie Kowalski had been running cross-country freight for 18 years, specializing in the long desert hauls that connected California's ports to the distribution centers of Texas and the Southeast. His 2016 Freightliner Coronado was built for the punishing miles of interstate trucking, and Eddie had maintained one strict personal rule throughout his career: never pick up hitchhikers. On the night of March 2nd, 2024, Eddie was hauling consumer electronics from Los Angeles to Houston, running his familiar route on Interstate 10 through the vast emptiness of the Arizona desert, when he encountered a hitchhiker who would force him to break his most fundamental rule and confront the possibility that not everyone seeking a ride was entirely human. Eddie had departed the port of Los Angeles at 8 p.m., timing his departure to cross the desert during the cooler nighttime hours, when his truck's cooling system wouldn't be stressed by the extreme temperatures that plagued the region during daylight hours. His trailer was loaded with 45,000 pounds of televisions, computers, and smartphones, destined for a major retailer's distribution center in Houston. Valuable cargo that required both security consciousness and precise climate control. Eddie was making excellent time across the sparse landscape, running slightly ahead of schedule and enjoying the peaceful solitude that came with night driving through one of America's most desolate regions. At 2:34 a.m., Eddie was climbing the long grade east of Phoenix when his headlights illuminated a figure standing on the shoulder of the highway, thumb extended in the universal gesture of a hitchhiker seeking a ride. The person appeared to be a woman in her 30s, wearing jeans and a light jacket that seemed inadequate for the desert cold. What struck Eddie as unusual was her location. She was standing in the middle of nowhere, at least 50 miles from the nearest town, with no visible vehicle or explanation for how she had arrived at this remote spot. Eddie's first instinct was to follow his established policy and drive past without stopping. but something about the woman's posture and appearance made him reconsider. She wasn't frantically waving or displaying the desperate behavior that Eddie associated with people in genuine distress. Instead, she stood calmly beside the highway, as if she was confident that someone would eventually stop to help her. Eddie pulled his truck to the shoulder, about 100 yards past the hitchhiker, wrestling with a decision that went against 18 years of road experience. The woman was alone in one of the most dangerous environments in North America, where daytime temperatures could reach lethal levels and nighttime cold could be equally deadly. The nearest town was hours away by foot, and Eddie knew that, without shelter or transportation, the woman's chances of survival were minimal. Against his better judgment, Eddie decided to offer her a ride to the next truck stop, where she could find proper assistance or contact family members who could help her reach her destination safely. He activated his hazard lights and waited for the woman to approach his truck, noting that she moved with a confident stride that suggested she wasn't suffering from exhaustion or dehydration. The woman climbed into Eddie's passenger seat with a grace that seemed unusual for someone who had presumably been stranded in the desert for an extended period. She introduced herself as Maria, speaking with a slight accent that Eddie couldn't quite place, and thanked him for stopping to help her. When Eddie asked how she had ended up stranded on the highway, Maria's explanation was vague and inconsistent. She claimed that her car had broken down, but when Eddie asked about the vehicle, she couldn't provide details about its make, model, or current location. She said she'd been walking for hours, but her clothing showed no signs of dust or wear that would be expected from a desert hike. Most puzzling of all, Maria seemed to know details about Eddie's route and destination that he hadn't shared with her, casually mentioning truck stops and landmarks that lay hundreds of miles ahead. As Eddie resumed driving, he began to notice other unusual characteristics about his passenger. The cab's temperature seemed to drop significantly after Maria had climbed aboard, despite the fact that the heating system was functioning normally. The woman's skin appeared unnaturally pale in the dashboard lights, and Eddie noticed that she didn't seem to be breathing in the regular rhythm that would be expected from someone who had been walking in the desert. Most disturbing of all, when Eddie glanced in his rearview mirror, he couldn't see Maria's reflection, despite the fact that she was clearly sitting in the passenger seat. The phenomenon was so unsettling that Eddie pulled over at the next rest area to check his mirrors and confirm that they were functioning properly. During the stop, Maria remained in the truck while Eddie performed a walk-around inspection, ostensibly checking his tires and cargo, but actually trying to understand what was happening with his passenger. When he looked through the truck's windows from the outside, he could see Maria sitting in the passenger seat, but her image seemed somehow insubstantial, as if she was a projection or hologram rather than a physical person. Eddie climbed back into the cab and tried to engage Maria in conversation, asking about her family, her destination, and her plans for getting home. Her answers were increasingly evasive and contradictory, and Eddie began to suspect that she was suffering from some kind of mental health crisis or drug-induced confusion. The situation became truly alarming when Maria began to demonstrate knowledge about Eddie's personal life that she couldn't possibly possess. She mentioned his ex-wife by name, described his childhood home in Ohio with perfect accuracy, and even knew about a trucking accident he'd been involved in 5 years earlier that had never been reported in any public records. "You've been carrying guilt about that accident for too long, Eddie," Maria said, her voice taking on an ethereal quality that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the physical confines of the truck cab. The other driver wasn't hurt as badly as you thought, and the insurance company's decision wasn't your fault. Eddie had never spoken to anyone about the emotional burden he'd carried from that accident, and Maria's knowledge of the incident was both comforting and terrifying. As the night progressed, Eddie began to realize that Maria wasn't simply a stranded hitchhiker. She was something else entirely. Perhaps a spiritual entity or psychological manifestation that had taken human form. She seemed to exist at the intersection of Eddie's consciousness and the mystical forces that operated in the desert's vast emptiness. The woman's presence was both comforting and unsettling, offering insights into Eddie's life and career that helped him understand aspects of his own personality that he'd never fully examined. Maria spoke about the loneliness of long-haul trucking, the sacrifices that drivers made for their profession, and the spiritual significance of the highways that connected America's communities. She seemed to understand the unique psychological challenges faced by people who spent their lives in constant motion, always traveling but never truly arriving. The climax came when Eddie realized that Maria was slowly fading away, becoming less substantial with each passing mile. Her voice grew softer and more distant, and her physical form seemed to be dissolving into the desert air that flowed through the truck's ventilation system. "Thank you for stopping, Eddie," she said, her words barely audible above the sound of the engine. Not many drivers would have taken the risk of helping a stranger in the middle of nowhere. "Your kindness has been noted, and it will be remembered." Eddie turned to respond, but the passenger seat was empty, with no sign that anyone had been sitting there. The cab's temperature returned to normal, and Eddie's mirrors once again showed only his own reflection. Eddie completed his delivery to Houston without further incident, but the experience with Maria had fundamentally changed his understanding of the highways he traveled. He learned that the desert roads were more than just transportation corridors. They were spaces where the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds became thin, allowing encounters with entities that existed beyond normal human experience. The road had taught him that sometimes the most important cargo a driver could carry was compassion for fellow travelers, regardless of their nature or origin. Eddie never again refused to help someone in need, understanding that the highways were places where human kindness could bridge the gap between worlds, and that every act of generosity had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate moment.